Great. Thank you so much. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today for Making Decisions Better, How Input Can Improve Outcomes. It's great to see so many of you in the chat. I see you're already connecting with one another, which is wonderful. We certainly encourage that, and that's part of the fun in participating in these webinars. So before we get started, I just wanted to review a few things about the webinar classroom so that you can get the most out of your session. We invite you to participate in several ways. If you have questions for our presenter, you can submit them at any time by using the Q&A feature, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if those questions don't get covered during the presentation, we'll queue them up for the formal question and answer portion of the session at the end. Similar questions will be combined, so just listen closely in case your question is answered within another. Likewise, if you have technical issues, just let us know through the Q&A feature. You're already using the chat, so feel free to share your tips and resources and ideas with the other attendees. You can also send a chat message privately to the host and presenters, but as you can see, the chat messages that do go out to all attendees and will be visible to everyone. So just keep that in mind as you compose your messages. Instructions for closed captioning. If you need that service, there is, if you look at the template of the presentation, in the lower right-hand screen right there, there's the Adobe logo. And above that, there's a little icon. We'll call it a Tetris-looking icon next to the sound button. You click on that, and then it'll bring up a screen that has all of, and then you want to click on Notes so that you're able to follow along. There's also a feature below the presentation. You'll see a box called Files, and that's where you can download any of the materials that are related to this session. So as the operator said, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Webinars for AmeriCorps Vista's page of the campus, along with all of the other sessions that we've presented. We'll begin here in just a moment. Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar for AmeriCorps Vistas on Making Decisions Better, How Input Can Improve Outcomes. We have a great team with you today. I'm your host, Liz Matthews. I'm with the outreach team here at AmeriCorps Vista headquarters. And helping me out today are Robin Stegman and Suzanne Knister. They're our partners at Campaign Consultation. And you'll see us in the chat and in the Q&A to assist you during today's session and to help get your questions answered. Our presenter today is Andy King, and he is the training specialist for AmeriCorps Vista. Andy oversees the AmeriCorps Vista webinar program and develops the Vista campus and helps in the design of PSO, the pre-service orientation that everybody attends prior to service. And in this session, he'll help us think about the types of decisions that we need to make in our service and look at ways that we can make those decisions better. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Andy.
Great. Thank you, Liz, and thanks everyone for joining us on this session. I want to start with a quote. This one comes from Mark Twain, who's credited with saying that good decisions come from experience, and experience comes from making bad decisions. I chuckle at this quote because I think there's some truth in the statement. And in today's session, I hope we can come away with some ideas for making good decisions by drawing on experience, even if that experience isn't our own. So that's what I hope, and here's what we're going to take a look at today. First, we're going to review some approaches to decision making, including our own, and get a sense of our own sort of default methods. We'll review a decision-making process that you can use as a template, and then we'll weigh the pros and cons of making a decision on our own versus involving other people in our decisions. And then finally, we're going to take a look at several group decision techniques. We'll point you to some resources and outline some next steps. So that's where we're going to go. And Liz, if you can advance the slide for me, it looks like I've lost my Adobe connection for a second. Before we dive into the to the presentation itself, I want to give you all a chance to begin a discussion on this topic. So we're going to use the chat feature now for conversation focused on the presentation. And so if you would please answer this question with just a brief answer. What are some of the decisions that you need to make as you carry out your VISTA role? So again, use the chat feature to the right. And in just a few words, if you could describe the kinds of decisions that, as a VISTA, you are making. All right, so I see some answers coming in, which partners to involve, where to spend my time, how to implement procedures, where to recruit volunteers, who to work with and where to put my focus, how much authority I have as a VISTA member. All right, so lots of things coming in, prioritizing, focus, information regarding newsletters, recruiting organizations, communications, partnerships. All right, so it looks like lots of different elements of your VISTA work require you to make decisions about how you're going to approach it, where you're going to put your energy, how you're going to prioritize. So sounds like you've come to the right decision, or to the right place to learn about decisions, rather. So there are a number of dimensions to the decisions that we all need to make. First of all, is it a personal decision or is it work-related? Are we deciding something that's going to affect only us or is going to affect a whole group of people? Another dimension is whether the matter that we have to decide is simple or whether it's complicated. And of course, simple decisions are the easy ones, and we don't have to really talk too much about those. But for decisions that affect other people, even if it seems to be a simple situation, we might need to have a process that allows us to really understand and evaluate the possible outcomes of that decision. And then lastly, is it a decision that we can make by ourselves, or is it best done collectively by a group? So for this session, we're going to focus mostly on work-related decisions, although you certainly could apply any of this to your own personal life as well. And we're going to look at when to make decisions on our own versus when to involve others. So when we're faced with a decision, many of us have an approach that we typically use. It's sort of our default approach, our default style. So one possible approach is a random approach, selecting from the options blindly or using a coin toss or other randomization method to make that decision. Another approach is intuition-based, where we make decisions by instinct or feelings or based on some general sense of the situation, rather than using conscious thought, evidence, reason, or a rational process. And then a third approach is one that's analytical. It's based on facts and data, analysis or logic, rather than relying on feelings or intuition. All right, so we've got another question for you in the chat. Which of these approaches do you tend to use in making decisions? Now, obviously, you'll have a range, but is there one that's kind of a default for you or one that represents what you typically do? So if you would, tell us whether it's random, intuitive, or analytical. All right, so I see lots of different, looks like there's a lot of people saying intuitive. There are a few that have a split, you know, a mix of intuitive with a little analysis, never random. Yeah, so it's kind of a split. It's hard to tell exactly the head count, but it looks like there's a nice mix between analytical and intuitive decision makers here. And that's kind of what we expect. All right, so with these different approaches, the random, intuitive, or analytical, each of them can be useful as long as they're used appropriately. And it's important to match the approach that you use to the actual decision that it is that you have to make. The random approach is useful for certain types of decisions, maybe like deciding which team gets the ball first or picking a lottery winner. It can also save time when the choices you have available are more or less equivalent in value, maybe like deciding which color of M&M is your favorite. The random approach is useful, though, in a really limited range of decisions, so we're not going to spend much time looking at that approach. So instead, we'll focus on the other two, which is where most of you, it seems, are actually focusing your energy. Whoops, it looks like I moved ahead. So we're focusing on both the intuitive and analytical approaches because these are really more useful to community work and therefore to your role as a VISTA member. The intuitive approach uses gut feelings or instincts and can be useful in situations where there might not be any objective data or when you've narrowed down all the options based on the analytical data and you need to pick one of the top contenders. A lot of hiring managers use this approach once they've done the on-paper analysis and they've compared education, experience, and skills of their applicants. And they use intuition to select a candidate from that top layer, to pick a candidate who's a best fit with the team and with the position. People who have a lot of experience in a particular field can also use intuition as a shortcut, bypassing formal analysis and using skills that they've developed over their career to make a good choice. So that's the use of intuition. The analytical approach is critical in really complicated situations or ones where the risks of making a bad decision are high. Because an analytical approach is objective, based on data and evidence, it can provide the best justification for a decision that might later be second-guessed by other people. But analysis takes time and energy, so it isn't always the most efficient way to go about making a decision, and it's not right in every situation. These two approaches, intuitive and analytical, are different, but they're not mutually exclusive. And as some of you indicated in the chat, it's possible to use a decision-making process that incorporates both intuitive and analytical approaches. It's probably a good idea to include at least some aspect of each in your decisions. You've already identified which approach is your own personal default, so you can see which other approach you need to work on incorporating into your decisions to make sure that you've got a balanced approach. All right, well, we're going to move ahead. I see we have the poll open, but most of you, I think, already responded in the chat. So we can move on to the next slide. We'll take a look at a decision-making process that we can use as kind of an example to guide our discussion here today. This is one that you can adapt for your own use. It happens to be a hybrid of several models that I took a look at. Or if you have your own model, that will work too. But basically, in making a decision, it's important that you work through a number of steps before you get to the actual decision. You first need to understand what it is that needs to be decided. Then you need to gather information about the situation, develop some possible options or alternatives, and then evaluate the options before you actually make the decision. And you can see after the decision is the implementation and the reflection and learning process. So this is a basic model. We're going to look at this throughout. In some cases, we're really quite capable of completing these steps on our own, but sometimes we will end up with a better decision if we involve other people. So let's first take a look at individual decision making. If you're faced with making a decision on your own, here are some suggestions. You're going to want to identify the balance of intuition and analysis that's appropriate for the decision. Do you have a strong gut feeling about the situation? Have you had good experience trusting your gut? Because if you don't have a gut you can trust, then you're probably not going to want to use intuition, and you should stick with analysis. Next, you need to know your limitations. Know what it is that you know, but also what you don't know. And don't be afraid to seek information that's going to help you out. Knowing when to get information and input is really critical to make sure that you're making an informed decision. And obviously, bigger decisions, ones with a greater risk, deserve more research. You need to identify trusted sources of information. You're going to want to use experts and authoritative sources rather than just relying on information that comes easily. It may come easily, but the sources are unknown or they're not really trustworthy sources. Next, you would conduct your analysis, applying your analytical skills or intuition if you're making an intuition-based determination. And here you're going to want to take time to make a list or a chart, spell out the pros and cons of each option. Try to look at the decision from many angles or from perspectives that are, represent those of different people who might be affected by the decision. Put it all together and see how the choices stack up against each other, and then you can make your decision. So you can see that making a big decision on your own can be daunting, especially if it's an area where you don't have a lot of expertise, or if the outcome is going to affect a lot of other people. In those cases, you might consider involving others in helping you with that decision. So I'd like to first, we're going to have another participation opportunity for you. I want to get your thoughts about why you think it might be a good idea to involve others in decision making. So what do you see as the benefits? And we'll use the chat again. What are the benefits of involving others in your decision making? And I see the answers are coming in. We can move the slide ahead. All right, so there's more information. You need community buy-in, different points of view, community sustainability, greater perspectives, new ideas. Great. So you all are coming up with a lot of the things that I'm about to say. So so we'll move on. Obviously, you've got this. There are many benefits, as you've noticed, of involving others in decisions, particularly if the decision is going to affect other people. First off, the decision itself is going to be better because it's going to have the benefit of more information and from a variety of perspectives, rather than depending on just what it is that you know or on your own point of view. The quality of the decision will be enhanced by the additional expertise of others who have greater experience or skill in fields relevant to the decision. So all of those are going to result in a better decision itself. Next is the implementation of a decision is going to be improved because those who are being asked to support the decision will have been involved in making it. Likewise, if the people implementing it are involved in the decision, they're much more likely to buy into it and they're going to work hard for its success. Okay, so, and Liz, I just want to point out I'm offline again, so if you can help me keep up, that would be great.
Sure.
Another question, we just looked at the benefits. Are there any drawbacks to involving others in decision making? Is there a flip side to this? Are there some possible costs to it. And again, you can use the chat. All right, so I see a few answers here. Too many cooks, too many opinions, takes longer. Others may try to take over. Yeah, it's time-consuming, conflicting ideas. Decision by committee can be a slow process. Could be misunderstandings, could get off course. Poachers, chance of offending someone. Could depend on the personalities involved. Okay, so great. You've highlighted exactly why there are drawbacks. So let's take a look at just some categories of the drawbacks. First of all, it takes more time. Getting others involved in decision-making can complicate the process. And so it takes time to contact them, to get them involved. You're also going to need to brief other people on the situation, providing them with background and research so that they have all the information that you've got available. Then they're going to need time to consider the situation, and then they'll have to get back to you with input. You could have everybody come together to do the decision in person or to do it virtually through a webinar or a conference call, something like that. That can save a little bit of time, but still just setting that up and finding a time to schedule it when everybody's available adds to the timeline as well. So those are some things that, some of the drawbacks that affect the decision itself. Then, depending on your relationship to the people you're involving, you might need to expend social capital to get their involvement. Sort of like calling in a favor. You're asking them to help, and you can only do this so many times before people get tired of participating. Have you ever had a roommate who can't decide what to wear without getting somebody else's advice first? I mean, doing that's okay if it's a special occasion like, a big date or a job interview. But boy, being asked every morning, if this outfit looks okay, gets old really fast. And the same is true with other, relatively routine decisions. You can't involve people in everything you do because they're going to get tired of it, and they'll stop participating. And as many of you noted, once you start involving others in the decision, then there's a potential for disagreement and even outright conflict, which could have some negative impacts on the decision that gets made. You won't be able to make everyone happy, and one possible result is that some of the people that you involved in the decision-making process, they'll end up not supporting the decision because it wasn't the outcome that they wanted. Later on, they could become a roadblock to implementing it or actually outright sabotage the implementation because they don't agree with the decision that was made. So those are some of the drawbacks of involving others. So we have to weigh that in mind before we reach out to get other people involved. So given that there are costs to involving others, you're going to have to be selective in determining when you call on others to be involved. How will you know which decisions should involve other people, and how much involvement do you need? Well, to answer these questions, there are three factors that you need to look at. First is the decision quality. How important is it to come up with the right solution? The higher the quality of the decision that's needed, the more you should involve other people in the decision because, as you noted, you'll have more information, more expertise, more perspective, all of that. Also included in decision quality is the level of risk. What are the consequences if the decision isn't a good one? Is this a one chance to get it right kind of thing? If so, you're definitely going to want to take the time to do that involvement process. The next factor is stakeholder commitment. How important is it that others are going to buy into the decision? When stakeholders need to embrace a decision, you should increase the level of participation. And then third, as we were just looking at, time constraints. How much time do you have available to make the decision? So if you have more time, you have the luxury of including others and setting out a process for that. And you can use that decision as an opportunity not only for their input, but getting their buy-in and even for team building. So those are the three main factors. There are a few others you want to consider as well. The complexity of the issue. Obviously, as we noted earlier, if it's a very complex situation, you might need additional expertise or information, things that you don't have available yourself. You're going to have to assess your own knowledge and your own expertise and experience in the area. If you've got what you need, if you have all the information, then probably you could go on your own. But if not, then that tells you you've got to get others involved. Next is the capability of stakeholders. Are the folks that you have available to call on, do they have any more information or experience than you do? Or are they as much in the dark? Because if they don't have anything to bring to the table, then it may be pointless to bring them in. Likewise, you have to think about how capable they are as decision makers. Can they actually be engaged in a decision process and function with that effectively? And then the last factor is how willing are these folks to provide input? And then how many times can you go back to the same people asking their help in making decisions? So these factors will play into it as well, and you'll have to have a sense of who your audience is or who your stakeholders are so that you can weigh in these factors as well. So looking at these factors, you might wonder, well, gee, how am I going to know if I've got all of this stuff? Well, there are some researchers that have worked on decision-making stuff for years, and those factors were developed by a team, starting with a guy named Victor Vroom at the Yale School of Management. And he's published some pretty widely cited books and papers with a couple of other researchers. They came up with 8 questions that you can ask to help you determine how much input is the right amount for a particular decision. So these questions kind of synthesize those factors we just looked at. So first, how important is the quality of the decision? Next, how important is stakeholder buy-in? Third, do you have enough information? And fourth, is the problem well structured? That is the issue to be decided well defined? Is it clear? Does it lend itself to making a decision? And then next, if you make the decision on your own, will your stakeholders buy into it? Will they be committed to what it is that you decide? And number 6 is then if you engage other people in helping to make the decision, do they share the same goals as you in solving that problem, or are there sort of opposing agendas at work? How likely is it that there will be conflict among stakeholders, and do your stakeholders have enough information to make a good decision? So these questions were adapted from this decision-making model that you see referenced there. It's not really a strict formula that tells you when you definitely need to involve others, but if you answer these questions, it will help you see when it's important to involve others and what the value of that would be.
Andy, this is Liz. We have a question in the Q&A. Would you like to take that now?
Sure.
Okay. Justin is asking, what if the main roadblock or saboteur to your VISTA project is the site or the sponsor? Any suggestions?
So if you think that the site itself is a roadblock, then that is a big challenge, and it's not, I think, probably not something that a single decision will be able to address, but it's one that certainly can't be ignored. So I would say a few approaches that you could take is to bring together those that you think are potentially sabotaging the project, and lay out what your understanding is of the project and its goals, and how you see your role in helping to make that project come to fruition, and get them to share what they think the project is all about. Get their opinions and their viewpoints and perspectives about what they think the project is all about, what its goals are, and what they see your role as, and how they see their own role in supporting you in that. And if there's been a big gulf, or a big gap between your understanding and theirs, then I think that will tell you very clearly where the issue lies, and then it lays it out in hopefully a neutral way, so that everybody can say, gosh, we're all working from a different set of understandings here, and we need to come together, because only with a common understanding can you all work towards a common goal. So that, I think, might be a place to start, and it's always best to start within and talk to the folks involved. And then maybe a one-on-one with your immediate supervisor, or if there's an overall program director or VISTA project supervisor at your organization, you might want to do a one-on-one there. And if that doesn't get you anywhere, then your next step would be to contact your state office and bring them in up to speed on what's been happening, and see what insights and support they can provide.
Great. We've got a couple more. Should we keep going, or do you want to?
Yeah, sure. If they relate to where we are, then let's cover them now, because other people might have the same question.
Okay, super. So Laura wants to know, should you limit the number of other people you ask for advice in making a decision?
Well, obviously, you don't have unlimited time, so you're going to have to factor that in. How much time and energy can you commit to getting input from other people? And you're going to want to, I think, be strategic in figuring out who you're going to ask. So you could ask 5 people who all have similar background and similar experience, and maybe represent the same perspective. But asking 5 people and getting the same answer 5 times doesn't really get you very far. So you're going to want to see if there's a way to target or identify individuals who will bring in differing points of view that will help make your understanding richer and more complete, and those who bring in additional information that maybe the first people you've contacted wouldn't have. So a little bit of strategy there, and of course it depends on the particular decision and the situation. But if you think about who your stakeholders are, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, then you may get a sense of when you've asked enough people.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Alice that has to do with the slide that we're on. Does decision quality have to do with high stakes, low stakes type of decisions?
Absolutely, and that's a great way to describe it, Alice. A high-stake decision is one that could be very public. It could be a decision that has long-lasting implications. It could be one that affects a lot of people. It could be a decision that's sort of a point of no return, like, well, once we decide we're going to do this, we can't undo it and go back. So all of those types of decisions, as you said, they're high stakes. Or as Vroom, Yetman, and Jago say, high risk. Those decisions demand a high quality, or those situations demand a high quality decision, because obviously if the consequences are really drastic, if you make a bad decision, or if you have to live with the decision for a long time, you've got to make sure you get it right. So you're exactly right on target with that.
There's 2 more that I'd like to cover before you move on. Eric is wondering, what about the case of a leader making a decision unilaterally, ignoring group process? How to maintain group cohesion when your opinion is not given consideration?
So I can't tell from the question if Eric is the leader or not the leader, but I'm guessing maybe he's not the leader who made the unilateral decision. It can be frustrating.
That's correct, he says.
Okay. So it can be frustrating that to be involved in a situation, to be part of a team, and decisions are being made without your input or consideration, and then you're expected to deliver on those, or to implement them, or to live with them, at least be affected by them. And so that's exactly why it's important and valuable, particularly in community work, to engage other people. So if there are decisions that need to be made or have been made without getting input, it may not be the end of the world. There may be opportunities to engage people in, from that point forward, to get their buy-in and to help, maybe moderate the decision or amend it in a way to make it better if it's not the best decision to start with. So one possibility would be to say, okay, maybe we didn't have a choice, and this was handed down to us, and so we just have to live with it. So let's take what's been handed to us, and as a team, let's get together and look at it and see, are there choices we have about how the decision gets implemented, or about the timeline in which we do it, or in who gets affected by it. So there may, even once the decision is handed out, there may be aspects to how the decision gets rolled out that could invite and allow input from other people. And in that process, then there may be some buy-in that happens. So I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, that's great. A nice comment here from Matthew. After good faith efforts with local leadership, I found looking to my project leadership and state office for perspective was useful. Because now I have a program that is moving well after a little nudge from above. Thank you, Matthew.
Oh, great. That's great to hear. Yeah. So it's nice to know that that the hierarchy and the things that are in place are actually working when the project maybe gets off track a little bit.
All right. So I think we can go back to your slide.
Okay, super. So we looked at those 8 questions, and say we get to the decision that says, yep, it's appropriate to involve stakeholders in the decision. So now let's talk about figuring out who specifically should be involved, and there was a question that touched on this. So obviously you want to bring in people who are going to add to the decision, add something to the process. So maybe it's people who have information or expertise. Maybe they've got experience in the community, something that's going to add to the quality and make it a better decision. If there are folks who will be involved or need to be involved in implementing it, you're going to want to get some of them involved. And those who are going to be affected by the decision. And you might not be able to get everybody who's affected, so it may be representatives or someone who could speak to the interests of those who are likely to be affected by the decision. And then the last category is people who can shape opinions about a decision and thereby get other people to buy into it. So in many communities, there are people that are identified as opinion leaders. If you can get them on board and get their buy-in, they can talk it up in the community, and their own position in the community and their own natural influence will help shape other people's opinions about it. And that can really swing the level of support and tip the balance in your favor. Specifically in VISTAS service, your stakeholders could be the staff or volunteers of your sponsoring organization. They could be staff members or representatives from some partnering organizations that your project works with, or they could be members of the community you're serving or a representative from the community. So I came across this quote from President Lyndon Johnson, who of course was instrumental in creating VISTA, and it's a word of caution from a man who faced a lot of difficult decisions during his presidency. He says, presidents quickly realize that while a single act might destroy the world they live in, no one single decision can make life suddenly better or can turn history around for the good. So it is a word of caution. The stakes can be really high in some decisions, and so the possibility of making a bad decision is very real. But he says even if you make a great decision, that one decision alone will not be enough to suddenly change everything. That good decision needs to be implemented well in order to have input, and it needs to be followed by another good decision and another good decision and another. So I don't want to alarm anybody with this quote, but I think it is a dose of reality that says, yeah, we can do everything to make a good decision, but then we can't rest on our laurels and spend too much time congratulating ourselves, because we've got to follow that up with really good implementation and then be ready to do good decision making next time around. Okay, well with that quote, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to start looking specifically at 5 different decision-making methods that can be used in making decisions. And again, one isn't better than another. It really depends on the situation. And so these are different tools in the toolbox, and you're going to want to choose the one that makes the most sense for the decision you're looking at. And these 5 general methods are arranged in order of the amount of stakeholder engagement, or to what degree other people are being involved in the decision. So the first is decide and announce, and basically that's making a decision on your own. The next one is getting information from other people, but you still make the decision on your own. The third, developing some options with the group, and then still making that decision by yourself. Fourth is a group decision process, and last is delegation. So as you move down the list, the degree of stakeholder involvement is greater and greater. So let's take a look at these one by one. And I've placed on the right-hand side of the slide that 7-step decision-making process, so we can see where, which step, which part of the process stakeholders are involved. So in this first one is either decide alone or decide and announce. Stakeholders are not really involved at all. They're not even consulted. In steps 1 through 5, all the way up to making the decision maker acts alone. And stakeholders only come in when it's time to actually implement the decision. So other people might have to implement it. Other people might be affected by the decision and have to live with the consequences of it. So this could be maybe some of you made this decision and announced it. Mom, Dad, I decided I'm going to become a VISTA. So maybe that was a method that you used in your own life. Next, moving down the scale a little bit, is seeking individual input, but still deciding alone. So here, the decision maker defines the problem and only reaches out to get some information. And in that process of reaching out, might not even be explaining why he wants the information or how the information is going to be used. So people who are providing that information are doing it a little bit blindly, a little bit in a vacuum. And then the decision maker is acting on their own in most of the steps. And again, when it comes to implementation or being affected by the decision, other people certainly may be involved, but by then the decision has been made. So that is still pretty much a lone decision process. Next up, C, is getting a group involved in setting up the decision, but then still making the decision on your own. So here, there's actually some real involvement in the process. The stakeholders have the opportunity to define the problem, to be involved in the research, providing input and perspective, and then developing the possible options or solutions to the decision. But their involvement ends there, and the decision maker or the leader then evaluates the options and makes the decision. And of course, those stakeholders still are involved or may be involved in implementing it, or they may be affected by it. All right, so these three decision-making methods that we've looked at have relatively limited involvement by others or by stakeholders. I want to talk just a minute about when those types of methods might be most useful, because there are circumstances where they are really useful. So for example, if it's a simple decision or the decision itself has limited impact, that could be a time when you really don't need a whole lot of other input into that decision. Or if it's something that you're actually going to do on your own, and you can implement it without involving other people, then again, you probably don't have to get them too involved in it. And as your own experience level grows, you can probably ratchet back the level of involvement that other people need to make on similar decisions, decisions that are close to the one that you just did. Other times that you might want to limit involvement has more to do with the stakeholders. So if they don't have any more information or experience that's going to be useful, then what's the point of involving them? Or if you have limited time, maybe there's a real pressure or you're put on the spot, you've got to make a decision and there's just no time to get other people involved, then again, it might not make sense to try to do that. All right, so let's now move on and take a look at a couple methods that have a much higher level of stakeholder involvement. So the first one is kind of a broad category that I'm just going to call group decision. And in the group decision process, the stakeholders are involved in virtually every step of the decision-making process. They define the issue, conduct the research, they develop and evaluate the options or alternatives, and then they make and actually implement the decision. So they also learn from it, and they use their experience next time around. So it's not a one-off thing, that they're learning and growing and applying the learning in the future. In a group decision process, the leader here serves as a facilitator to guide the process and also can weigh in with his or her own perspectives and information and experience and opinions. So the leader is the facilitator rather than the decision maker. So that's a big shift here with a group decision process. And as you can see, group decisions can result in people being really invested in the outcome of the decision. Their buy-in is going to be higher, their support is going to be higher, and they're going to take responsibility for making it work. And in a minute, we're going to come back and look at some specific types of group decisions. But before we do that, I want to just look at the very last method, and this is called delegate or delegation. And it means to give away or delegate the responsibility for that decision to other people. In this process, the leader gives stakeholders the authority to make the decision within certain parameters. They can't go crazy, but there are always some guidelines or ground rules or some parameters that they have to work within. But the stakeholders manage the entire process, and once they're done, they report back, or they could even report along the way so that the leader has a sense of how things are going. For this to work, the stakeholders have to be competent, obviously, to make the decision. They've got to have the information and experience that's needed so they can do a thorough analysis and come up with a good decision. They also have to be able to manage themselves and to work well as a team. You know, if you have people that can't get along, then delegating a decision to them might not be the right thing to do. The stakeholders also need to be trustworthy. You've got to be able to trust that they will come up with a decision that's in the best interest of all and that's true, stays true to the original request. There's one possible drawback to delegation, and that is the question of accountability. If you delegate the decision, can you hold those accountable, those who are involved in the decision, can you hold them accountable for the decision they made? Or is the responsibility going to rest with you? So that's a question that you'll need to consider and think through. Because oftentimes, particularly in organizations, organizations want somebody identified who is accountable so that there can be follow-up and further action if that's needed. So delegation, can be a great way to give ownership and investment and buy-in, but it's not always an option. And that's why we have leaders, people who are identified and tasked with the responsibility of making decisions and being accountable for them. All right, so that's delegation. Now I want to come back to group decision making. And this type of process, there are lots of different variations, but it's used a lot in community work. And so it's something you've probably seen and may already be involved in. So I want to talk just a little bit about it as a method. There are lots of different techniques. I want to give you just a few that you can think about and consider using in your work. So the first group decision technique is called group averaging. And in our kind of work, in VISTA work, there aren't a whole lot of uses of it because it depends on choices that can be quantified numerically. So a lot of our work isn't numerical, so it can't be averaged out. But an example that came to mind is if there's an organization that does heating assistance for low-income families, you could maybe ask members of a community advisory committee to each name a dollar amount that they think is the right amount of assistance for families in need, collect all those answers, average them up, and use that as the amount to use. So like I said, it doesn't have a lot of use in our work, and you can see the possible drawbacks of using that. But I thought I'd mention it just as a point of comparison. The next method is one that's common. It's voting. And there are lots of different types of voting. Even in a simple one-person, one-vote system, there are different types. There's majority rule, which we're all familiar with. There's a supermajority rule where it takes a higher threshold, say 60%, before a decision gets adopted. At the other end of the spectrum is plurality rule. It's a voting system where the option that gets the most vote wins, even if it only gets, say, 30% of the vote. If it got more votes than anything else, then that's the option that moves forward. Voting is familiar to us. It's relatively simple, so there's a tendency for folks to want to use it, but it too has some drawbacks. And so as you probably have experienced, though in a voting system, if you're one of the people whose preferred choice didn't get selected, you might not feel inclined to support the one that did win. So, it's like there's one winner and a whole bunch of losers, and so a lot of times in community work, that's something that you really want to avoid, is having people feel like they were shut out or that they were a loser. Within voting, there's also what's known as multi-voting systems. And these can be really useful in narrowing down a long list of options. So the way it works is that everyone gets multiple votes, several votes that they can use to indicate their feelings, their top choices, rather than having to choose just one. So a really simple rule, simple way of doing this is to take the number of options that you have and divide them by 3. This is referred to as n over 3. And the result is that the number of votes each person can cast. So let's say you have 10 options to choose from. 10 divided by 3 is 3.3. So each person would get 3 votes. And they could cast their votes any way they want. They could put all 3 votes on one option if they feel really strongly about it, or they could spread their votes among 2 or 3 options, and moving them up to maybe a next round. So you would use the results to narrow down the choices, and then you'd use another round of voting or some other technique to get to the final choice. A couple more decision-making techniques. One is, next up is consensus. And consensus is a collaborative process that's based on getting people involved in providing their support for an option. And if there are issues or questions or challenges around those, that they continue to refine the option until it becomes something they can support. So the idea is that you want everyone to give their consent with nobody objecting. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a minute. And then the last technique that's listed here, it's a unanimous decision. And it's one that you're familiar with if you've ever seen a trial by jury. You know that in order to convict somebody, it has to be a unanimous decision. So everybody has to agree before that decision can move forward. That's a very high level of agreement. It's really hard to achieve, particularly in community work. So unanimous decision is not used very often in community work. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about consensus, talk a little bit more, because it is one that's used in community work, and it's something that you may see. So as I mentioned, it's an inclusive group decision-making process. It involves cooperation and compromise that's used to come up with a decision that everybody can support, even if it's not their first choice. In other words, everyone gives their consent and no one objects. In order for consensus to work, the group first has to develop a level of trust and engagement so that they can work well together. And as you know, that takes time to build trust, and participants first have to get to know each other and understand where everybody's coming from, know what the interests and find out, sort of what the agenda is for other people. So consensus isn't a technique that you would use with a group that's only going to meet a few times because the time investment might not be worth it. Let's take a look at a simple model for consensus so you'll have a better idea of how it works. This is a really simple model. There's a lot that goes into consensus. So this is really just the most basic approach for using it with a group. So the first part of it is to generate a proposal, and that's done collaboratively. If we compare this to our 7-step decision-making process, it would really be the first 3 steps: defining the problem, gathering information, and developing alternatives. So basically, the group works through those 3 steps, and they identify the most promising alternative that's there, and that option becomes the proposal. The next phase of the consensus model is to then identify any unsatisfied concerns. So this could be challenges or problems that somebody has with the proposal itself, or maybe it's the fact that there's something that hasn't been considered or some opinion that hasn't been asked for. So members of the group can share which aspects of the proposal, if any, cause of concern. And ideally, when someone raises a concern, they also offer a potential solution. So it becomes a very constructive process, and it engages people in getting to a better solution. So it's not just a chance to throw rocks at the proposal that's up there, but it's engaging people to help make it better and ideally get to the best possible proposal. And then the third phase is to modify that proposal to generate as much agreement as possible. So it's kind of going back and forth between steps 3 and 4, coming up with alternatives and evaluating them, going back and refining and doing another evaluation. So it's kind of a cyclical process. Once everybody's had a chance to raise their concerns and offer possible solutions, then the group works together to come up with a final proposal that they think will get as many people supporting it as possible. And if you get, if the group gets enough folks where everybody's comfortable with it, then essentially the decision is made, and step 5 becomes just a formality. It is possible in a consensus model that you won't get full agreement, that there'll be a few people who just aren't comfortable no matter how many times you refine that proposal. And so then the group has to figure out if the existing level of support or agreement is enough to finalize that decision, or if they need to fall back on perhaps some other decision-making method if consensus gets to a roadblock. So as you can see, this can be a time-consuming process. It depends on a level of trust, cooperation, and goodwill among the participants that might not always be there. It also requires a strong commitment to a positive outcome for the benefit of all. So if someone comes with their own agenda, they can sidetrack or derail a consensus process. And so you've got to have allowances for that and a method for handling it so it doesn't derail. Likewise, if there are many concerns that can't be addressed, then the process can get bogged down and can stop moving. So you wouldn't use this technique for everyday decisions. It is, however, a really powerful way to engage the community in decisions that require widespread and lasting support. And when you've got that support, it can really help ensure that the implementation is going to be successful and sustainable for the long term. All right, so we just looked at 5 different methods of decision making, and so you may be asking yourself, oh, how do I know which decision I should use, which method I should use? So let's look at just an example, a relatively straightforward one, of a decision that a VISTA might need to make in their project work, and let's see which method might be appropriate. So the example we're going to use is you've got to decide where the site is going to be for a community garden. And with this kind of decision, you could use any of the 5 methods. So I want to just walk through and see what each of those would look like. So the first, in the decide and announce method, you could make the decision entirely on your own. But if you do, you not only run the risk of choosing a bad location, you might have trouble then getting community residents to participate in the garden if they don't like the location. In methods B and C, where you are getting some input from the community, but you're still making the decision on your own, those 2 approaches might help you pick a better location, but you still might have issues with participation if the residents think that it was decided by an outsider, if they consider you to be not really part of the community, there still may be some resistance. Even if the location itself is fine, it could be a matter of perception and perspective that, gee, it wasn't really our decision, so we're not going to support it. With a group decision method, it would clearly get a better result because not only are you getting more perspective and information, you're also going to get greater investment in the decision itself, and then a sense of ownership for the garden that's going to last over the long term, even after your year of VISTA service is done. You can see that a group decision in a case like this, where it's, it's something that's going to take ongoing implementation year after year, where it might be worth investing in a group decision. And then last is delegating that decision. If the group of community residents has been working together for a while, and if they've shown that they can work well together, then delegating the decision might be an even better process. They'll have full ownership of it. They'll be able to explore all the options and pick the one that they think is best. So for long-term sustainability, this might be the best option. But it's only going to work, of course, if the residents are already working well together. So that's just a quick look at how you might take one of your own decisions and walk through these and get a sense for yourself of which method might work and which of those might even be the best method. All right, so we're about ready to wind down. I just want to recap some of the things we've talked about. We started out by looking at our own default approaches to decision making. Are we random or intuitive or analytical? And we saw how our decisions can benefit from having stakeholder involvement, but also that we need to balance that input with an efficient process so that we don't get bogged down or that we don't overstay our welcome by asking people too often to weigh in. So in approaching any decision, it's important to match the method that you're going to use with the decision at hand, based on the complexity of the decision, your own knowledge and experience, and then the needs and the capability of your stakeholders. We're going to get to your questions in just a second, but I want to point out a few resources before we get there. On the VISTA campus is an interactive course that's called the 5 C's, and one of the C's in that is community, and there are a number of resources there. I want to reiterate, Liz mentioned that in the file section just below the slides, you can see there's a PDF version of this presentation. So the links are there, and we'll also be emailing these out to everybody after the session. So you don't have to write these links down, but I just want to mention so you'll know that they're out there. Some other resources that are available outside the campus are listed here, several on different decision-making methods, and there's even a course on the Open University on making decisions. And the last resource here is an introduction to consensus. It's one of the best things that I've seen on consensus that's available free of charge online. But I do want to mention it's from an older website that was hosted on a GeoCities site, and it hasn't been updated, so it's just in archive form here. But I don't think that a ton of information has changed about consensus. But I just wanted to mention a little caveat that it's not a currently updated resource, but it's pretty good reading if you're interested in more background on consensus, some of those specific techniques, and then some of the considerations for how to make it work well. All right, so you're thinking, okay, gosh, a lot of information here. What do I do with it? So if you're looking for suggestions on what you can do, here are a few. First off, make a list of the decisions that you need to make in your VISTA role. And then for each one of those, you're going to want to rate the complexity, the degree of risk, how high are the stakes, as someone mentioned, that need for quality. Then next, for that decision, assess how much information and knowledge you have and how much experience you have that's going to help you in that decision. If you determine that you need to get other people involved, then identify who those stakeholders are that you want to engage, and then determine which decision-making method you are going to use. So that's just a suggestion for how you might move forward with this information. So now I think we're ready for questions. Liz?
Yes, indeed. And I want to maybe go ahead and ask our folks at Campaign to open the poll, because I know that everybody is taking time out of their day and they may be exiting here quickly, and we'd love to get your feedback on the call. So if we could open the poll up, that would be great. You'll see it there under the chat and the Q&A. So please let us know. There we go. Things are changing. Bear with us. There's the evaluation. Okay, so yes, please give us your feedback. It's really valuable to us because we are then able to improve our webinars and make sure that we are addressing your needs. I actually didn't have any questions in the Q&A, so maybe operator, if you're there, perhaps you can see if there are any calls coming through on the phone.
Absolutely. At this time, we'll open the lines for question and answers. If you would like to ask a question, please dial *1 on your touch-tone phone and record your first and last name clearly when prompted so that I may introduce your question. If you would like to withdraw your question, you may press *2. Once again, that is *1 to ask a question, *2 to withdraw a question. Please allow one moment for our first question to arrive. At this time, we have not had any questions to arrive in queue on the phones.
Okay, thank you, operator. And my Q&A box seems to have disappeared on my screen. So I know there weren't any right before we switched to opening up the evaluation. So let me just take a moment to remind folks that we do have more great webinars coming up. The next one is Living on the Living Allowance. So depending on where you are in your service year, you can get some great tips that might really help you out. So that's on March the 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Campaign, do you all see any questions in the Q&A feature?
I do not see any questions at the Q&A at this time.
Okay, great. Well then, Andy, thank you so much. People were very thankful to the information that you shared in the chat. And so, again, thanks everybody for not only taking time out of your day to take care of your professional development and learning and hopefully get some new information that you can apply, but also just for the dedication that you make to be an AmeriCorps VISTA member. We know what a sacrifice that is, and we really appreciate your dedication and your enthusiasm. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again online.